I love food. Not only can it be really delicious, but we need it to live. If we don't eat food, we'll die. Thinking of it that way, eating is an act of life, an act of humanity. The kinds of food you eat can say a lot about who you are. Today, we'll be taking a look at how the realism and relatability of the food in The Witcher helps ground the fantasy, taking special interest in exploring how Polish identity is featured in The Witcher through its cuisine. Specifically, we'll be diving into the history of 19th century Łódź by making a recipe from The Witcher cookbook, Zalewajka, which is not only a dwarven recipe from Mahakam, but a traditional soup from Łódź, following Andrzej Sapkowski's own recipe. My name is Nimue, and you're watching my channel all about The Witcher books. Welcome to Anis Vitre. Let's start off by talking about how food is presented in The Witcher books. To mimic the real world, Sapkowski often uses food to help the readers understand a character or a situation before he even introduces the food items themselves, building a specific atmosphere around them. He uses the character's relationship to food as their motivation, as well as an element to build empathy and relatability with the reader. We need food to survive. That much is true. And because of this, the absence of food can, at times, become unbearable. Something which I think that the current adaptations of The Witcher struggle to convey is the ever-presence of hunger. Our main character, Geralt, for instance, often finds himself in situations of hunger, and in some cases, near starvation. In these cases, interacting with food, for him, becomes a deeply emotional experience, and it does so too for the reader. Such as in the short story, A Little Sacrifice, which begins with Geralt and Dandelion, both working on commission, unable to find paying work. Because of this, they have no money for food, and we begin the story by watching them starve alongside one another. "You'd better tell me how much Aglaval paid you." "He didn't pay me anything. He claimed I had failed to carry out the task, that he had expected something else, and he pays for results, not good intentions." Dandelion shook his head, took off his bonnet, and looked at the Witcher with a forlorn grimace on his mouth. "You mean we still don't have any money?" "So it would seem." Dandelion patted his horse's neck, and fished around in his saddlebags for the umpteenth time. Geralt knew he would not find anything there they could sell. The smell of food, borne on a breeze from a nearby tavern, was becoming unbearable. Then, by a stroke of luck, Dandelion receives an offer of work to sing at the wedding of the son of the local spice merchant Teleri Druhard, and along with the payment for singing, he is also given an invitation to the food and festivities of the party, and this invitation also extends to Geralt. As Dandelion accepts the offer, Sapkowski reminds us of the tempting scent of food leading them to do so, their motivation. Geralt smiled and hopefully breathed in the scent of food wafting from the tavern. The Witcher circulated amongst the guests, looking for an opportunity to finally occupy a seat at the table, which was laden with victuals. He gazed longingly at the rapidly vanishing pickled herrings, stuffed cabbage leaves, boiled cod heads and mutton chops, at the rings of sausage and capons being torn into pieces, and the smoked salmon and hams being chopped up with knives. The problem was that there were no vacant seats at the table. Geralt, overcoming his embarrassment, virtually forced his way to the table. Geralt got down to eating without delay, and in a flash had cleared the only dish he could reach. I begin with this scene as an example of how Sapkowski's prose often highlights instinctual, deep-set reactions around food. Almost everyone can remember a time when they were so hungry, the moment they got food, they just devoured it on the spot. The vivid imagery of the food on display makes Geralt a sympathetic and relatable character, as he, hungry and tired, stuffs his face full of food. And hunger is not the only food-related feeling that Sapkowski features in The Witcher, but overeating too. They talked until lunchtime, looking through portfolios and fascicles of prints. The Fisher King had been lucky with his catch, because there was grilled salmon for lunch, for supper too. Count Wirmers slept badly that night. She had overeaten. The Fisher King had been lucky again, because there was smoked char for supper, fish so tasty that the lesson wasn't learned. Count Wirmers stuffed herself again. She burped and tasted the smoked char. Time for bed, she thought, for the second time catching herself mechanically turning a page in the book without registering the content at all. Time for bed. By emphasizing the pain and intensity of hunger, as well as the delicious and fulfilling qualities of the food they eat, Sapkowski emphasizes his characters' familiar, lifelike, and human qualities. Like us, their stomachs can be either bitterly empty or awkwardly full. Like us, they think about food, their next meal, their previous meal. Many times, the characters of Witcher eat the same things we do. Sapkowski often features his characters eating, or otherwise engaging, with food that is familiar to his audience. And when I speak about his audience, Keep in mind that The Witcher did not become an international phenomenon until much later. Sapkowski in the 1990s was writing for fantasy readership in Poland, as well as in nearby countries in Central and Eastern Europe, with similar food cultures. As such, many distinctly Polish, Central, and Eastern European dishes feature in the Witcher series, either mentioned or consumed directly by the characters in memorable scenes. Of these foods include pierogi, the most famous dumplings of Poland and even a national symbol, szaszłyki, or what we call in English shish kebab, which is different, by the way, than the Turkish kebab, which might be the most famous Polish food, actually. Gołąbki, which are stuffed cabbage rolls typically cooked in tomato sauce, and the name means little doves, by the way. Pączki, which are jelly donuts that are so good that there's a holiday devoted to them, Fat Thursday. Barszcz, which is different than Ukrainian borscht, which is different than borch, 3 jackdaws. Yes, some people have confused the soup with the dragon. Garareta or auszpik, called aspic in English. This is maybe one of the Polish foods I probably will not be trying. Not that I have anything to say about it, as it was historically a huge thing in the US during the 1950s. Rosół, or chicken soup. Żurek, another very famous Polish dish. It's a sour rye soup that's typically served with boiled egg, and sometimes in a bread bowl that's traditionally eaten on Easter. In The Witcher, they seem to have it for breakfast a lot. Białe kiełbasy z wyciku, white sausage with braided beet and horseradish relish, which Regis humorously plays with a peg from during Lady of the Lake. Kasha, a porridge of groats, which can be savory or sweet, but in The Witcher they had kasha with pork. Kiszona kapusta, fermented cabbage, the German version of which would be sauerkraut, and the Korean version of which would be kimchi. Rynki kaszane z cebulą, blood pudding with onion. Obwarzanki, famous round pretzels covered in poppy seeds from Kraków. And finally, Zalewajka, which is what we're making today, another sour rye potato soup, also under the category of żur. Totally random, but in The Witcher, żur has a fascinating association with the postal service for some reason. It shows up in postal stations both in Tower of the Swallow and Crossroads of Ravens, and I'm not quite sure why. I couldn't find any historical reason, so maybe it's just a quirk of the world building. On the topic of Polish identity represented through the food in The Witcher, something else that I wanted to point out, because I noticed it while reading the newest book, Crossroads of Ravens, is how David French's English translation has previously handled some of these dishes, and how that recently changed. When the core series was translated during the 2010s, the food words were always translated to an English equivalent or approximation. For example, in the translation of The Little Sacrifice, gołąbki are stuffed cabbage leaves. In the translation of Tower of the Swallow in Season of Storms, Zalewajka is potato soup. And in the translation of Lady of the Lake, rosół z lanymi kluczykami becomes chicken broth with dumplings. A little misleading, maybe it should have been poured dumplings, because before I looked this up, I had always imagined Regis eating some shaped folded dumplings, more like pierogi, which, by the way, is already the plural version of word. You do not need to add an S to it, as it is printed in A Little Sacrifice. What was I talking about? Oh yeah. Something I noticed in the English translation of Crossroads of Ravens, which came out last year, was that lots of these words for food were not translated, and instead kept in Polish, such as obwarzanki and gołąbki. Personally, I like the stylistic change. I don't know exactly what caused it. Maybe the publisher wanted to represent Polish identity in The Witcher more, but it intrigues me and it seems meaningful because it means that somewhere along the line a decision was made that not every word needs to have an anglicized version in order to connect with the English reader. I know some people might say that it's pretty obvious to write characters' connections to food because, like, everybody eats food, but something I want to point out, not to bring my Netflix hating into this non-Netflix video, but one thing that I noticed immediately when watching the first season of The Witcher on Netflix is that no one really eats. Like, even in the feasting scenes, nobody seems to really eat. It's a little bit strange, you know, it's a little bit alien. And this is something that I think really contrasts with the books.
What are you fishing for exactly?
I'm not fishing. I'm looking for a gin.
For a gin? Like a gin?
Brother, this guy stinks!
Because in the books, food is part of life, just like in real life. Maybe the Netflix series wanted to make it so that their characters are like superhuman and they barely even need to eat, but that's kind of part of the books, that they are human and they have these needs. What's more is that Sapkowski often features a familiar natural environment that the characters frequently live off of. And this is another place where I think the Polish identity of The Witcher comes through. To a Polish, and probably also to a broader broader Central European audience, the environments Sapkowski describes are likely familiar. The main continent is composed of fields, hills, forests, and mountains, set between rivers, lakes, and streams. And that's obviously not to say that we don't have those things outside of Europe, but the kinds of environments he describes seem very Central European to me as an American reading it, which adds to the very fairy tale atmosphere of The Witcher. And he also pays attention to the details. Like in this world, the specific fish they encounter are often mentioned, and in the narrative are even the basis for several emotional moments, like Dandelion and Geralt catching a catfish in The Last Wish, or Cahir catching a 3-pound pike to contribute to the fish soup in Baptism of Fire, or even Regis roasting trout on spits over a fire that he greets Geralt and Cahir with in Tower of the Swallow. Speaking of this trout, I also want to point out that they were mentioned earlier in Baptism of Fire from the streams off the hills of the Ruger River. And then they also appear in Tower of the Swallow as coming from the Sandratur River. And finally, they show up again on the horseshoe-shaped table during the October banquet in Beauclair, which means that the ecology of the Ruga Nevi Sandratur was kept consistent between installments. Thank you very much. And I think that it's safe to say that these details come from experience, as Andrzej Sapkowski has a great love of fishing. Then let's talk about fishing. With great pleasure. I've been doing it for a long time. We have a specialized club, fishing for salmon. We leave on the river, each with a mobile, and if something happens we ring, rise upstream, there's a better bite. And the number of this mobile is known only to my wife, my publisher, and my colleagues in the club. No one else. No journalists, no fans. How is ecology in general in Poland? It's getting better. Now Wisła is cleaner. But by the way, I always let go of the wild fish. I only take the ones I catch in the special farms. Fishing is more of a sport than food. On this topic, it's actually a little-known fact that the famous fish soup of Geralt's company, which I'd like to talk about in a sequel to this video, is actually an original and personal recipe from the author's own life. I was contacted by the author of a cookbook that's supposed to contain recipes from so-called famous people. Without thinking twice, I gave him a very detailed recipe for making fish soup, exactly the same as the one the company cooks in Baptism, including the so-called camp version. I've cooked this soup so many times that I can confidently call myself an expert. In addition to fish, a lot of hunting game is also featured in The Witcher. Birds such as geese, partridge, thrush, and grouse, and four-legged animals like venison, boar, rabbits, and squirrels. Of course, when Milva Barin enters the picture in Baptism of Fire, we begin to hear much more about this realm. And this may sound obvious. I mean, if you go outside and touch grass, this may be of no news to you. However, as someone who lives on the west coast of North America and has researched before where to get some of these fisher animals, I've realized that a lot of them just straight up don't exist around me, because where I live and where The Witcher is from just don't have the same ecology. My environment has a different climate, environment, animals, plants, and natural features. Plus, I live in a saltwater environment, so I guess I live in more like Sidaris than Sodden.
I am going to stick out like a horseshoe crab in a freshwater environment.
So I do believe that the environments of The Witcher evoke a specific locale, one which was familiar to Sapkowski and to his primary audiences, and one which is foreign to audiences like me who are from the US. I point this out because I feel like the environment of The Witcher sometimes gets taken for granted, especially by some previously mentioned not-so-good adaptations. The natural world of The Witcher may resemble a Slavic fairy tale, and sometimes Europe, a very non-specific term by the way, is understood as the just default location to stick a fantasy. But in The Witcher's case, it feels like an intentional depiction to evoke familiar landscapes, to bring the fantasy into reality, or vice versa. Now, it may seem clear and obvious that landscapes and flora and fauna from this real-life context would obviously exist in the imagined universe too. In a fantasy world, why wouldn't you? Why couldn't you find fields of grain, a linden tree, or a 3-pound pike? But that's kind of my point. These things don't have to exist in fantasy. Plenty of fantasy universes have their characters living on entirely alien planets or in alternate dimensions, with plants and creatures that are entirely made up. Although The Witcher obviously has monsters and other various few made-up plants and animals, they're also not just invented because they kind of look cool, they're usually based on folklore. In contrast to the entirely made-up fantasy, the world of Sapkowski's Witcher is much like our own. The characters living in this fantasy do not dine on fantasy foods. Instead, they feast on a similar breakfast that you may have had this morning, and a similar soup to the one you might have later this evening. In their wildernesses, they find the same animals you might find, much more often than they do fantastic or mythological creatures. Like, for example, when they're in the wilderness in Baptism of Fire and also in Tower of the Swallow, they encounter like a monster, like a non-real thing, maybe like once with like the eye head in Baptism of Fire Chapter 2. And there's talk of ghouls and all these things in Tower of the Swallow Chapter 3, but they don't run into any. And of course they run into the druids, which have the trees, the ents. But like, it's not like they're just running into ghouls and neckers all the time the way you might in The Witcher 3. I mean, of course, like, they had a vampire with them, but like, doesn't really count, okay? The characters in The Witcher feel about food the same way you do, anticipating their next meals with hunger and succumbing to fullness after they've eaten. These realistic qualities help define the characters as lifelike people, living, breathing, and subject to the same morality and stakes which real people are. My broader takeaway is that food is a way in which Sapkowski brings the real world into fantasy, connecting the two together. That brings us to our featured recipe for today, Zalewajka, a sourdough potato soup which first appeared in Łódź and Radomsko during the 19th century. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution, when Łódź became a center of the textile industry in Poland and exploded in population. Of course, this time was also during the partitions, a period of history in which the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was divided between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. After the Second Partition of Poland in 1793, the area of Łódź was controlled by Prussia and begun to be settled by German immigrants. In 1806, it was incorporated into the Napoleonic Duchy of Warsaw, but after that was dissolved in 1815, it became part of the Congress Kingdom of Poland, which was basically a Russian puppet state. Because Łódź doesn't sit on any natural resources like salt or silver, there wasn't any mining industry to be had. So instead, it was designated as a new textile center, which was an economic opportunity at the time. The textile trade was in high demand. Soon, the city was flooded with workers who came to work in the factories. This is also when Jewish identity in Łódź came to take shape, with Jewish immigrants working as merchants, bankers, industrialists, workers, and factory owners. Business became very lucrative, and the multicultural identity of Łódź can be represented by the three kings of cotton, Ludwig Geyer, Karl Schleiber, and Israel Poznański, who are textile magnates who owned factories, spinning mills, workshops, and warehouses. From there, from what I can tell, it pretty much played out like the Industrial Revolution as it was all over. Exploitation of labor and hazardous working conditions, which led to great class disparities and tensions. This is how Łódź found its industrial identity, gaining the moniker the Manchester of Poland. Of course, to me as an American, that doesn't really mean anything, except I know Manchester only because Daphne Moon from Frasier is from there.
I'm a bit psychic.
And this is the Łódź in which we find Zalewajka. The workers of such an industrial city needed to sustain themselves, and so the hearty rye and potato soup makes perfect sense. And here's how I followed the recipe written in the Witcher cookbook. I started 2 nights beforehand by prepping some of the ingredients. First, I peeled the potatoes and sliced an onion. The recipe calls for 2, but as you can see, I only had 1. Next were the chanterelle mushrooms. Something that I want to point out is that mushroom hunting is a huge thing in Poland and a lot of the Slavic countries. It's even considered a national sport. So if someone made this recipe during mushroom season, that means they probably would have been free because, you know, you can get them from outside. I live in a city where I can't pick mushrooms, not only because I never grew up doing that, and I would probably poison myself, but because of pesticides. If I don't end up poisoning myself, the city's use of pesticides will. So I got my mushrooms from the grocery store, where they cost like $12, which for context is like 45 zloty. I think that this can serve as an illustration that what's cheap in one cultural context might be a delicacy in another. Amongst the other chief ingredients for our sour soup was our sourdough starter. I already keep a sourdough starter, so I didn't have to go through the process of making one specifically for this recipe. I just took some out to prepare the special one. Because this recipe does require you to have a cup of specific sourdough starter flavored with seasonings. To make it, I used dark rye flour, 2 garlic cloves, black peppercorns, and bay leaves. The recipe calls for allspice, but unfortunately I didn't have any and it was a little bit too expensive just to buy one whole thing for this video. The starter still smelled heavenly though. I also made bread to accompany our Zalewajka, because, like, bread. For this, I just did my regular ratios of sourdough, except I used about half dark rye flour, half bread flour. I popped it in my mixer with my dough hook, and after letting that rest, I did some stretch and folds. The night before I filmed, I prepared my dough by shaping it into a boule and letting it cold rise in the fridge overnight. Finally, the other ingredients we needed for this recipe were a package of bacon, garlic cloves, salt, butter, marjoram, and black pepper. But you won't see these in this footage because I only used them on the day of filming. Random note that according to Wikipedia, the Łódź version of this uses sausage, while the version from the adjacent Świętokrzyski Voivodeship uses bacon. Sapkowski's version, in both Season of Storms and in the Witcher Cookbook, uses bacon. However, the capital of the Świętokryski voivodeship is Kielce, where we know that his mother came from a village nearby. So it might be a recipe inherited from his mother, but that's my own speculation. But before we start cooking, let's explore the identity of Łódź a little bit deeper. Łódź first shows up in written records in 1332 as Łódź, a small remote village located amongst woodlands and marshes in the middle of the Kingdom of Poland. Like the majority of villages, its economy was primarily based in agriculture during this time, with recorded activity in grazing animals and logging forests. The origin of the name Łódź is thought to have derived from the river Łódka, which the village was constructed upon the banks of. The more obvious etymology of Łódź is that its name means boat in Polish. Łódź is literally the word for boat, which is reflected in the city's seals and coats of arms. Let's examine for a moment how Łódź became defined by its industrial identity, and owing to this, how it was othered, exotified, and even had its Polishness debated. In fact, the authors of the book From Cotton and Smoke, in their examination of Łódź during the 19th century, emphasized its similarities to its Western counterparts rather than its native Polish ones, as the identity of the city became shaped around industry. This industrial urban identity positioned it as somewhat of a foreign element within Poland, and this was for several reasons. First of all, the population of Łódź was indeed multicultural. Not only had it been under Prussian control for a bit, but many foreign settlers also arrived to the city during 1816, when privileges were granted to artisans that moved to the Kingdom of Poland. Settlers rushed from the west, from Saxony, Prussia, the Czech countries and Silesia, and even France and Portugal. Poles accounted for almost 50% of all Łódź inhabitants, while 36.4% were Jews and only 11.5% Germans. As it was developed into a textile hub, the government began to grant loans and invest in the city more, which drew foreign weavers. So although Łódź was firmly in the Kingdom of Poland, even though that was basically part of the Russian Empire, especially after the 1860s, by the end of the 19th century, Łódź was by population half Polish Catholic. The presence of German and Jewish capitalists in Łódź, moreover, was also a source of ethnic conflict and tension. Economic stratification remained dependent on national divisions. While German and Jewish capitalists were still the wealthiest group of the city's population, most Poles remained uneducated workers. Conflict between Polish workers and their German foremen was tense and reached its apogee in 1892, when the working class rebelled against ethnic and economic exploitation. Secondly, Łódź's perceived lack of Polishness came from its connections to faraway industrial counterparts through trade networks rather than neighboring Polish cities. Łódź's production and the wealth it produced didn't reach the cities next door, since the goods it produced were exported. At the same time, it used local resources like water in the production of its textiles. Especially after the 1860s, when the Kingdom of Poland was unified completely with Russia and became the, quote, industrial spearhead of the empire, the majority of Łódź's produced goods and resources were designated for Russia. Łódź was positioned on the increasingly porous borderland between the Russian world empire and European networks of knowledge and technology transfer. It used to have much more in common with its faraway industrial counterparts than with places it directly neighbored. Between 1879 and 1900, 3/4 of all products manufactured by Łódź's factories being exported to Russia. Finally, Łódź's position as an industrial city represented a harsh new global modernity that contrasted with traditional Polish identity. A typical modern city, it stood out from the local context. Exploiting natural resources and attracting surrounding rural populations, it was a foreign body against the backdrop of local social and cultural ties. Not only was this visible in its very construction and landscape, being a crowded city with hundreds of factory chimneys and smokestacks towering in the skyline, rather than, stereotypical Polish landscape, idyllic golden fields of grain, Polish identity had traditionally been tied to an agrarian economy, where land-owning nobility, or szlachta, held power over the peasants, or chłopi, in a system of serfdom.
Hop, 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 hop.
Now, to be sure, that's an oversimplification of the unique political system of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but it will suffice for this video. Once the Russian rule abolished serfdom in 1864 and gave land to peasants, which was thought to be mostly an act of revenge on the Polish landowners for the January Uprising, the individual lands that the peasants were newly entitled to were typically too small to actually make much of a living from. Thus, the Polish workers of Łódź were mostly peasants who had been former serfs, or whose families had previously been serfs. This meant that their presence in the city was a symbol of them no longer working for the fatherland. Instead, their labor was now benefiting Russian industry. Neither was the city of Łódź easy to live in during this time. It had all the troubles of a typical city which had rapidly industrialized: extreme overcrowding, poor sanitation, widespread poverty, and frequent epidemics of tuberculosis and cholera. It was also somewhat dangerous. Crime was rampant, and after the suppressed 1863 uprising, the system of local authorities were extremely limited in power, and they were also usually corrupt. Not a big surprise for Polish history. I mean, I shouldn't really say that as an American living in 2026. And as you can probably recall from what you learned in school about the Industrial Revolution, the quality of life for workers was pretty poor, and they were by and large exploited. Factories offered extremely low salaries, sufficient only for a minimum subsistence. In order to cut wages further, local industry employed a large proportion of women and children, comprising up to 55 to 60% of the labor force. They were paid from 30 to 70% less than male workers. They nevertheless had to work, as men's wages were insufficient to make ends meet in a working-class household. And there were no social forces capable of challenging this status quo. Every form of worker resistance was nipped in the bud by virtue of the close cooperation between the industrialists and the Russian police and military services. All in all, life in Łódź during the 19th century was very difficult, for not only was it, as the authors write, a perfect illustration of all the problematic aspects of rapacious 19th century capitalism and the social attitudes which it evoked. But tensions within the city were also uniquely heightened owing to local historical, ethnic, and political context. For these reasons, Łódź gained a poor reputation, which was, quote, dragged through the mud by journalists elsewhere in Poland. During this time, Łódź was seen as a bad city, as an alien city of corruption and depravity. This reputation began to be explored not only in journalism, but in fiction. The novel Cotton by Vicente Kosiakiewicz in 1895 was the first to coin the term Lodzermensch, or Lodzermensch. I barely know how to pronounce Polish words. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation of the German words. By the way, the reason why I got confused about the pronunciation of Lodzermensch is because Łódź is pronounced Łódź and not Lodz, because it's not spelled Lodz. Because the Polish L is not the English L. It's pronounced more like the English W. Whoa. Bro, I'll call my life the Polish language for how I always turn my L's into W's. Anyways. The term was later popularized by the novel Ziemia Obiecana, or The Promised Land by Władysław Remont in 1899, the same author of Chłopi, or The Peasants, which received a really good adaptation a couple of years back. You should probably go check that out. The title of The Promised Land is somewhat ironic, as a major theme of the novel is about the loss of morality and labor exploitation. In 1975, Andrzej Wajda also adapted the novel into a film. The novel presents a setting of Łódź in a dark manner, almost like a force of nature which ruins and corrupts. Here are two passages from the book to compare and contrast. The first is from the point of view of Trawiński, a cotton mill owner who's gone into debt and is wallowing in his powerlessness, having lost his capital. He took a cab and went off, straight down Piotrkowska Street. He could not think at all. He was broken, unfit for anything, for any movement. So he gave himself up passively to the acrid and all-pervading wave of bitterness that surged within him. He looked around him, on the dingy town wet with rain, muddy on the sidewalks, swarming with humanity, on the uncountable chimneys, rising straight as poplars above the flat roofs and vanishing in the lowering gloom, to make their existence known only by clouds of white vapor, hovering over the houses, on the coal wagons in their hundreds, forming an immense chain in which one extremity was entering some factory or other, on the multifarious conveyances rushing in every direction, at the multitudinous offices and warehouses, those full of people, these piled with goods, and on the strain and stress of life that seethed around him. On all these things he gazed, in something like despair. He felt his own powerlessness, felt that, in no long time to come, he should drop out of that enormous whirlpool, out of the huge machine called Łódź, like a bit of used-up matter which the monster needed no more. The second is from the point of view of the protagonist Borowiecki, the son of a nobleman who becomes the manager of a factory. He liked going thus, to and fro, without aim or purpose, to feast his eyes on men and factories, to sniff and pry all about the place, to inhale those whiffs of air saturated with coal tar effluvia and the odors of dyes. His head was turned with the mighty greatness of Łódź. The prodigious riches hid in warehouses and factories made his eyes gleam with a greedy flame, awoke tremendous visions in his mind, and filled it to overflowing with longings ever more intense to rule and to revel. That mad whirlpool of life, that river of gold that spread all over the town, intoxicated him with irresistible potency, mesmerized him, filled him with unspeakable thrills of craving, incited him to fight, to win, to plunder. And he loved it, that promised land, as a beast of prey loves the illimitable wilderness, full of creatures for it to devour. He adored it, that promised land, flowing with gold and blood. He hankered, lusted for it, stretching out his insatiable arms to it, crying out with the voice of victory and the voice of hunger, "Mine, mine!" And for a while he felt that it was to be his forever, that he would not let loose his prey till he had sucked dry its veins of gold. Jesus Christ. For transparency, I didn't actually read the whole book yet because I found it later on in my research and I wanted to get this video out in June. But luckily, I was able to find an English translation of it on the Internet Archive from 1927, and the prose was so good that I just really wanted to include it in this video. I found doing all this research on Łódź's history very funny because I was more familiar with the present-day tourism photos from Łódź that look like this. The factory of Izrael Poznański actually became a shopping center that has freaking Nike and Burger King in it, by the way. Which, some might say, is another picture of capitalism. A Lodzermensch, as the stereotype goes, was explained in a 1902 article from a Warsaw weekly. This foreign word means, in direct translation, a man from Łódź, and it has gained status as a citizenship, as depicting a typical Łódź careerist. The main feature of a Lodzermensch is a lack of any ethical principles. The end justifies the means, and this end is the making of the biggest possible amount of money. Work from dawn till late at night, exploitation of men and women, and a ruthless indifference toward anything which is not profit. And although the city and public opinion of it changed somewhat during the 20th century, the textile industry did not fade. Even after the tragedies and horrors which the Second World War wrought on the city, specifically speaking about the ghetto set up by the Nazis, the textile industry continued during the communist period. Maybe because of that, despite the city having changed so much, the old identity of Łódź is sometimes still referenced to this day, especially by one such author of The Witcher. Andrzej Sapkowski has occasionally referred to himself as a Lodzermensch, i.e. the so-described ruthless man from Łódź who cares about nothing but work and profit. Now, I know that some in the fandom might go, so he admits to it. But I think if anyone is seriously offended by this, they're missing the context of self-awareness here, and the poking fun at himself. Even before any of the controversy about the games appeared, Sapkowski also seems to have had a reputation in the 90s as an obsessed workaholic. Although he did work at the ridiculous pace of a book a year for most of the Witcher saga, he dismissed these claims in several interviews, explaining that now as a writer he sets his own schedule, and joking to not tell his editor that. Still, the self-identification remains, including in his foreword for the Witcher cookbook. Zalewajka is a traditional Polish soup, rooted in the times of our promised land, consumed as it was by the textile workers of the Schreiber, Guyver, and Poznański factories. The smell of Zalewajka is the smell of the city of Łódź. It's a smell of my childhood, me, a second-generation Lodzermensch. It was nice of the authors to honor my original recipe for mahakmam Zalewajka with a place in this book. I thank them both. And one might wonder, with Sapkowski's strong ties to the city of Łódź, what is his impression of his home and if it's influenced his work. To answer this, let's start with an extract from an interview he had with Bohdan Godomski, another Łódź native. How do you like living in this sad, poor, gloomy city of Łódź? Not great, to put it mildly. Indeed, every city has something that makes you say, it's ugly, unpleasant, but Łódź, unfortunately, has no but. This city has only flaws. Jesus Christ, man. By the way, that's how the interview starts. Like, that was the first question and answer. You gotta love the attitude. We get another glimpse of Łódź through Sapkowski's eyes from another interview. Was the city of your childhood the gloomy Łódź from the Promised Land? Of course, there were no flashy neon lights or advertisements. Cars were a rarity on the streets. But it wasn't as bad as it's made out to be now. Anyway, the world has more charm when seen through the eyes of a child. I'm curious how Łódź, a city with which you have very strong ties, influences your view of the world. Do you consider yourself a Lodzermensch? I'm not really a typical Lodzermensch. My mother's family didn't settle in Łódź until the first generation, and my father is from the Vilnius region, and I'm indeed connected to Łódź. Unfortunately, I was born here, raised here, studied here, worked here, got married here, got divorced here. This is where I became a writer, and for now, all of this is headed towards the Łódź morgue, I'm unlikely to break free from here, which is my greatest failure in life. Very funny. That all being said, I can't help but relate the realism and so-called bleakness of the Witcher world to Sapkowski's origin and wheelhouse. After all, he studied foreign trade in the Faculty of Economics at the University of Łódź, and worked in the textile industry himself as a foreign representative of the company. Before he wrote The Witcher, he was a businessman that traveled overseas, and whose job it was to talk with people about the national company. This is also how he got more into fantasy, as he spent a lot of time reading fantasy books in hotel rooms and airports. Getting back to your life before 1985, what exactly did the job of a salesman entail in the People's Republic of Poland? Socialism and marketing seem somehow at odds in my mind. You're wrong. Poland had to trade because the industries of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance countries simply couldn't produce many things, and to buy, you also have to sell. So what was socialist marketing all about? With these questions, I feel a bit like a grandfather explaining to his grandson how it's possible that there was no McDonald's under Stalin. But, well, I'll give it a try. Socialist marketing was a very strange institution. A popular saying went that it consisted of figuring out how to spend the marketing budget that had been allocated, because if you didn't spend it, the higher-ups would reduce your budget. In reality, most of it went towards presenting Polish products at international trade fairs. I prepared and managed a great many exhibits at a great many trade fairs. As a representative of the Polish textile industry? No, as a representative of the Polish Foreign Trade Headquarters. A representative of the industry did accompany me often, but he himself had no authority to sign anything. You asked me what kind of influence Łódź had on me. I think foreign trade had the greatest impact. In trade, there's no room for ideologies or chauvinism. Here, an Arab has to get along with a Jew, and a communist with a capitalist. Signing a contract never looked like two grim groups in suits sitting across from each other. That's how negotiations with the Soviet Union within the CMEA looked at most. Contracts were often concluded over dinner, at informal gatherings. You had to know how to make a good impression, smile, tell a joke, chat about art, hunting, gambling, and women, and think positively, and you left all your grievances and prejudices at home. The view of profits and markets which Sapkowski presents in his books are always strikingly veristic. But is the stereotype of a Lodzermensch true? Is everything business and no heart? In Sapkowski's case, I think not. Because he does pay special attention to the topics of industry within his writing, but that never negates the heart. The conflicts of his stories, no matter they be the personal concerns of his characters or large-scale national battles, they're primarily economically motivated, and the industries in this fictional world are always presented in solid, fleshed-out detail. I mean, just to prove a point, the entirety of the comic short story Eternal Flame revolves around the personal financial crisis of the merchant halfling Dainty Beavervelt, whose identity was stolen by the Doppler Teleco, a kind of shapeshifter. While in Dainty's form, Teleco sold his horses, and with the money, purchased a wealth of seemingly random items, provoking the halfling's ire. One of the more memorable quotes from this story, alongside Dandelion's talking about the Passiflora, is that money has to circulate, and business has to be kept moving. But not only that, because moving into the second act, Dainty is informed that apparently, somehow, Teleco made a profit on all of this, but didn't pay tax on it. And you have to pay tax on everything. But he has nothing to pay them because he doesn't have his profits. So his only hope becomes to catch Teleco and get the money from him. And as he's searching from him, he finds out from another business associate and from the dwarven banker Wim Vivaldi that he indeed made profits on all of this, but it starts to look very suspicious because the business transactions that Teleco made couldn't have been made without secret political insider information. They only made profits because of coups d'etats and political events happening elsewhere in the world. So his activities suggest that he participated in insider trading, which makes Dainty look extremely suspicious. So now the authorities are doubly after him, with Chappelle, the head priest of the Eternal Flame, personally investigating him. And at the end of the second act, we're left with another saying: I have no idea, but the wheels of business must be oiled. Finally, as the story comes to a close, the conflict is resolved in a funny and charming manner when Geralt confronts Teleco and he reflects in him his own emotionality, as well as revealing that the final purchases he made in Dainty's identity also made fantastic profits. And not only that, but Chappelle himself is a Doppler who's taken his form, so he won't persecute Dainty or tax him on the profit. When I first read the Witcher series, this was one of my favorite stories for just how silly it is, mixed in with its heartfelt themes of social acceptance and self-acceptance. Back then, I was more of a fan of the B-plot going on with Geralt and Dandelion rather than the main plot with Dainty and the Doppler. But rereading it, I found found the main plot uniquely excellent, because Sapkowski somehow made business, industry, and even tax funny. And he's also remarked that all of the figures are correct. I want to organize my fictional world in a very believable way, so I can't escape from money because it rules everything. As in real life, an imagined fantasy world must also have trade exchanges in all its stages: money flow, capital accumulation, banks, usury, and so on. It seems to me both an amusing and moralizing technique. And I've always boasted that the reader can check everything on a calculator and see that all calculations are correct. That's the skill of a writer from Łódź. And what about Geralt? Geralt from Łódź? I don't mean the fantastic article by Marzec, but the question of Geralt's character. Does Geralt have the makings of a Lodzermensch at all? Although I think that author-character comparisons can unfortunately at times fall victim to shallow and lazy analysis, I also think that is a topic sometimes worth exploring. Geralt is interesting in this regard because, as a Witcher, his world does stereotype him as ruthless, as a killer for hire, greedy and obsessed with payment. But he's really just trying to make a living and survive. While Geralt is firm about his work and the prices he charges, he knows his worth as a professional, and that's probably the farthest thing one can get from greedy, because he often sacrifices himself for others. He doesn't take corrupt contracts and operates on his individual rigid system of morals. On the topic of Geralt's character, Sapkowski said, "The attitudes of the Witcher are sometimes unprofitable," and I think that defines them both nicely. Of course, Geralt has another connection to the blue-collar spirit of Łódź, which is the actual labor he performs. Although he doesn't go to work in a textile mill, and he's also an educated man with special training and even university education, rather than a peasant worker, his job as a Witcher and the troubles he gets into demands that he feed himself appropriately, which he unfortunately does a little bit less often than he'd probably like to. In a slice-of-life-like example from Season of Storms, Geralt found himself exhausted from escaping from bandits on horseback. Seeking refuge in a roadside inn, he's almost denied service before the dwarf Adario Bach defends him to the innkeep and demands that he also have a serving. This is where a bowl of Zalewajka makes an appearance, and Geralt is given a moment of respite and friendship. That is before the bandits come knocking again and it turns into a whole tavern brawl. But my point is that Geralt, as a Witcher, with a demanding lifestyle as he works with his body for a living, he requires the appropriate sustenance. A nourishing bowl of Zalewajka. All right, hi, welcome back. I have my sourdough here, as you can see. He has risen, he is proofed quite a bit, and I am going to pop him in the oven. I have my Dutch oven preheating at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour now. So I'm gonna transfer this guy onto some parchment paper and then stick him in the Dutch oven, and then we'll see him in about 40 minutes. I usually bake sourdough in a loaf pan because I like making sandwiches with it. This method is pretty, but it takes like way too long. It's also annoying because sometimes it sticks to the freaking towel. We have a boule now. So this is the Dutch oven. If you guys do this at home, be careful because this thing is very hot. There he goes into the oven for, let's do 40 minutes. Now with that done, we can begin our soup. So I've prepared all of my ingredients. We have the chanterelles, the onions, the potatoes, marjoram, salt, our rye starter. This is just my tea that I've been sipping. And finally, the bacon, which I have yet to cut. So let's do that now. The recipe has us begin by tossing the bacon into a skillet with a splash of cold water. That's a splash. Well, that's a splash. Meanwhile, I boiled some water for the mushrooms and soaked them for a minute in a saucepan. You can see. Then my bread was done baking, so I took that out of the oven. Dutch oven is really heavy. Ugh. Wow! Yay. The timer for 1 minute is already done. All right. It's freaking go time. These are the mushrooms, you guys. Ooh. I think this is literally just fat in here now. It's not water anymore. Ooh. I added the onions to the bacon with the garlic and stir-fried. Yes, I switched to chopsticks. Switching to chopsticks is always faster than reloading. Note to self, you are not a meal regis. Do not try to grab things. Do not try to grab horseshoes, nor baked potatoes, nor our lovely sourdough. Oh my God, it smells so good. Guys, all I've had for breakfast today is like a little bit of panettone and an espresso shot. So this is like, is smelling so good right now. I'm kind of skeptical of why we need to add butter if we already have all of this bacon fat. But I mean, that's what the recipe calls for, okay? I'm not in charge here. When that was done, I transferred everything from the skillet into the pot. Butter is melted. In go the mushroom action. Actually, it was a good idea to add butter. It's always a good idea to add butter. I fried the mushrooms in the butter, then added those to the pot too, and deglazed. Whee! Pot is looking pretty good, you guys. Then I added my potatoes, marjoram, salt, and covered it all with water, letting the whole thing simmer for about 15 minutes. So our soup is boiling, so we are going to drop the heat to low, and we're gonna cover it. Our 15 minutes is up. Ooh, looks good. Finally, I added in my seasoned sourdough starter. Add in while stirring with a wooden spoon. Ooh, okay. Ooh. Let's give that a little stirring action. And then after adding the starter, we simmer for 15 more minutes. Whoa, holy crap, the texture of this just changed. I'm going to let this simmer. Oh my God, you guys, it smells so good. It smells like if bread was a soup. As someone who often just does this with the sourdough starter, this is gonna be like so good. Oh my God. All right, we're done. All right, let me show you guys what the soup looks like. Okay, I'm going to get my bowl and we're gonna serve it up. Bowl has been procured. You can see the texture of the soup is very thick. This is like a rice bowl. It's not even made for soup, but it's a nice pretty bowl that I thought would look good on camera. I also don't know if I was supposed to cut the onions into like these little stringy slices, but I really like the image of Dainty Beaverbelt eating his onion pottage, or well, not Dainty Beaverbelt, but doo-doo, in the form of Dainty Beaverbelt, eating the onion pottage in Eternal Flame. And then like the little string of onion is just sort of hanging from his spoon, and it begins to quiver when he's afraid of Geralt. All right, so this is our table spread. We have our rye sourdough bread, a little bit of butter, just in case you want some, and our serving of Zalewajka. First, we have to cut our sourdough. I hope it rose enough. I hope it actually leavened. And there we are. You can see it's kind of more of a dense crumb. I'm gonna carve myself off a good slice of this. Okay, I'm gonna just try the bread first, because I love bread. Distinct rye flavor, very good. Very squishy. Can you see that? It's very doughy and very squishy. I'm quite pleased with the texture of that, it's good. I also have some marjoram and some black pepper, so we can season this a little bit to taste. I do really like black pepper, so I'm just gonna give myself a good amount of that. And then a little bit of marjoram. All right, looks good. What does Dandelion say in About to the Fire when they're cooking the fish? He goes, Alles Zapach.
Alles Zapach.
Yum yum, smells good.
Yum, yum.
All right, everybody, smacznego. I'm gonna get some potato. Oh my God. Holy shit. Dude, I'm having my mind blown right now. That is so hearty and delicious. Oh my God. It's like a pretty cold day. It's actually, as I am filming this, it's Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving. So it's like November, 28th right now? So we're in winter and it is cold, and this will keep me warm. It reminds me, you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of juk, which is like Chinese porridge, basically, like rice porridge. Obviously, there's no like ginger in here, but like in juk, you'd probably add like some ginger and garlic to it as well, so it would take up all of that like flavor. And a tradition that my family has also is using turkey stock. So like last night, I made a bunch of turkey stock from the leftover Thanksgiving turkey, like the bones and the, you know, the turkey carcass and all that. We use that stock to cook the rice in. And so what you're left with is like this very savory porridge. Like, it's not the exact texture, but like this texture is very reminiscent of juk for me. Also because you would also usually put leftover turkey in the juk or bacon or, you know, like some little bits of meat or something. So, bro, we should try it with the bread. Oh my God. It's like 3:30 p.m. and this is like my first real meal of the day. All the fat rendered out of the bacon, so now it's all like, it's very meaty and it's not chewy. There's no like a fat chewiness to it. I found a chanterelle, so let's try the mushroom. There's not like too much flavor in it anymore. I guess mushrooms always have like a kind of mild taste anyways, but I feel like what it had boiled out into the soup. I don't know. There's a little bit of umami in there though. The flavor of this is so unique though. Like, I guess because I've never really had like a sourdough soup before. I mean, literally you cooked sourdough starter with the soup. As someone who wishes they could drink sourdough starter, this is kind of a dream. I think I'll actually probably make this again this winter. I might not be able to source the mushrooms, but you can also use dried mushrooms for this recipe, so I might just do that. I'm surprised at how flavorful this is because we didn't add like any carrots or celery, which I usually add in soups, so I'm quite happy that the flavor of the sourdough starter actually comes in the soup. And of course you have like the bacon. I think the bacon fat is doing a lot of heavy lifting here as well. This video is gonna be like 5% essay, 95% me eating soup. I already finished. This is a really good autumn winter soup. Hell yeah, you guys know what I can do? I can use some of the bread and literally just like scoop up. Oh yeah, the butter softened up. And you know what's also like very fitting about this soup is that, okay, so today right now it's 55 degrees outside, Fahrenheit obviously, and that's too cold for me. 55 degrees Fahrenheit, too cold, okay? That for me is a winter temperature. And let me go check my phone here. Let me see what I can see, what the temperature is in Łódź right now. Oh, well, it's nighttime, obviously. But it's 27 degrees in Łódź right now. It's 3:30 right now, and here it's 55 degrees. When the sun comes up in Łódź, at 3 p.m., it will be partly cloudy and a whole of 30 degrees. If this is already too cold for me, and this soup is fulfilling to me on this cold day, I can only imagine, you know, if it was colder, if it was 30 degrees, how much this soup would be needed. I was also going to say, because like, well, I'm not really someone who counts calories, but I do try to be mindful of, you know, how much I am consuming of stuff. But when you're in a cold environment, when you're in cold weather, your body actually uses more calories, more energy to keep you warm. So this being loaded with like flour and the bacon fat, it makes a lot of sense because people were laboring in the textile factories for very long shifts. And so they would probably need like something to fulfill them for more than 8 hours at a time. I mean, I imagine people would set out to work from their homes in the morning and they probably wouldn't get back until the evening. So, all right, I'm done. Bro, I ate a whole bowl. That's good. 5 out of 5 stars. This was very good. Thank you, Andrzej Sapkowski, for the recipe. Thank you to the authors of the Witcher Cookbook for formatting the recipe and many others. And I just get like a little bit more bread. Time to clean up. And that's a wrap. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like or sharing with your friends. A big shout out to everybody who's donated through the Ko-Fi page, and if you'd also like to support the channel and videos like this one, you can donate there. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I've been Nimue, and I'll catch you next time on Anis Vitre. I think I'm gonna get more soup.